I'm particularly excited for our lecture today. We have a long history in this country of challenges regarding unequal treatment around race and ethnicity, and I'm excited to hear an often neglected portion of that history with Susan Kamei today. I'd like to ask Aaron Skabeland, who is Associate Professor of History of Japanese History here at BYU, to introduce our speaker. Aaron.
"80 years ago, last month, on February 19th, and 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order led to the incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese, 2/3 of who were American citizens, who were evicted from the West Coast and imprisoned in camps in the interior, including at Topaz outside of Delta, an hour and a half from here. And if you have not had the opportunity to visit the museum and campsite there, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning Susan Kamei of the University of Southern California. Susan is a graduate of the University of California, Irvine, and received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center. At USC, she teaches an undergraduate course about the constitutional, historical, and political issues related to incarceration and the importance of those issues today. In the 1980s, she was a member of the legislative strategy team for the Japanese American Citizen League that waged a successful campaign to get Congress and then President Reagan to pass and sign federal legislation to provide redress to Japanese Americans who were imprisoned during the war. Last year, during the earlier throes of COVID, I listened to an online Japanese family history devotional organized by a former missionary who I had served with in Japan. And Susan happened to be one of the speakers. I learned that she had just published this book with this wonderful title, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. And if you don't have a copy, I urge you to get one. And I thought, given the 80th year anniversary, we've got to have Susan come to BYU. I am glad that that day is coming to pass. Welcome to BYU, Susan, and thanks for sharing this important story with us.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm so honored to be included in the Kennedy Center lecture series this semester, and especially on the topic of engaging global inequality. And I hope that our time today, I'll be able to give you some insights into a powerfully tragic episode in our nation's past that's resulted from the unequal treatment of a racial minority and the importance of recognizing and preventing such episodes from occurring again. This is the trickiest part, I'm told, of the... yeah, I know. I'm told it's all in the angle. Well, I'd like to start by telling you about my grandfather's trunk. One afternoon when I was in high school, I was over at the home of one of my good friends who was celebrating her 16th birthday. And the tradition in her family was that the girls in the family would receive from the mother a hope chest, a decorative chest, a place to keep their special keepsakes. And this concept intrigued me, and I thought of my grandfather's trunk that was gathering dust in my parents' garage. I didn't know anything about its history except that with its metal clasp and its leather handles, it looked to me like it could have come from the Titanic. I asked my mother if I could use the trunk in my bedroom, and I remember she was surprised, and she said, "You want that old thing?" And then agreed, but somehow I got the feeling that she might have been pleased that I wanted to use something that had been a possession of her father's. And later, once I had hauled it up to my bedroom, she very casually mentioned that when she and her parents, quote unquote, left for camp, that from Little Tokyo in Los Angeles in May 1942, that her father had used this trunk to store some of their belongings that they had to leave behind. And that was all she said. And it took me years to understand the significance of what her phrase, leaving for camp, meant. It was not summer camp or something pleasant or enjoyable, and in fact, it turned out to be something quite the opposite. These camps were the detention facilities that were hastily constructed by the U.S. government to imprison approximately 120,000 of persons of Japanese ancestry for the duration of World War II, simply on the basis of their race. Oh, I'll get this. On the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, my father and his family were working in the fields of their vegetable farm in Orange County. Around noon, their landlord came to tell them that he had heard on the radio that Japan had bombed a place in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor, and that they had better go inside. That night, 2 FBI agents came to the door of my father's home. They did not have search warrants, but they barged their way through the home and into the backyard, startling 2 of my aunts that were bathing in the family's backyard Japanese bathtub. Because he was not a community leader, my grandfather was not arrested. But by nightfall, the FBI had arrested 2,000 other men of his generation, known as the Issei generation, up and down the West Coast, simply because they were, for example, principals in Japanese language schools, leaders in social and civic organizations. They might have even been martial arts teachers, Buddhist and Shinto priests, and even travel agents who had done business with Japan. In most cases, the families left behind had no idea where their husbands and fathers had been taken, and they, in many cases, would not be reunited with them for many years. What my dad's family and the other families of the Japanese Americans did not know at the time was that the FBI had pre-identified the Japanese community leaders among the Issei to be ready to arrest them in event of the anticipated war with Japan. These Issei men were arrested because they were aliens, but ironically, they and all other Issei were precluded by law from becoming naturalized citizens, no matter their intentions of making America their adopted country. The next morning, my father sat in his school assembly at Huntington Union High School as the entire school listened to President Roosevelt's address to Congress when he declared that the United States was in a state of war with Japan. And even as a 14-year-old freshman, my father knew that their lives had forever changed and that things were going to get ugly. An honor student, he ended up dropping out of school rather than deal with the animosity and expressions of hatred targeted against him and anyone else perceived to have the face of an enemy. It made no matter that he and other children of the Issei pioneers, known as the Nisei, or second generation, were American-born citizens. Quite quickly, the prevailing view became that due to their race, the Issei immigrant aliens and their Nisei citizen children would be wholesale sympathizers with Japan and should be suspected as potential spies and saboteurs disloyal to the interests of the United States. Many of the Issei had gone to great lengths to show that their loyalty was to the United States, even though they could not change their status as citizens of Japan. The Issei immigrants lived in this never land of state of identity, neither being completely in one country nor the other. The Issei were also caught between two narratives about immigration that are at odds with one another. One I call the Statue of Liberty narrative. This narrative is based in the reality that almost all of us are here in this country because we or our ancestors were immigrants, those who came here seeking better opportunities, or refugees from political, economic, or religious hardships and oppression, or even as persons enslaved against their will. The line from Hamilton, "Immigrants, we get the job done," celebrates the multi-ethnic heritage of the United States, either as a melting pot or perhaps more accurately, a tapestry woven together of different ethnic and origin identities. However, a different and perhaps harsh reality is that from the very founding of our country, there's been a pattern of those already here distrusting and fearing the next wave of immigrants and trying to prevent or limit their migration here. I call this immigration Nimbyism. Now that I've gotten in, no one else should. Immigration Nimbyism is as old as our country itself. In 1798, our second president, John Adams, and his Federalist Party passed the first of a series of Alien and Sedition Acts that restricted immigration and the ability of immigrants to become naturalized citizens. During the contentious debate in the embryonic House of Representatives, two congressmen actually came to blows on the floor of the House, as depicted in this political cartoon. And who were the hated immigrants whom our founding fathers wanted to keep out of our new country in 1798? The French and the Irish. In this political cartoon of the time, the French are depicted as a five-headed monster. You may know from your own family history that waves of other European immigrants followed, and they in turn faced intense discrimination, such as the German immigrants during World War I. While those from Europe and Africa came across the Atlantic, the Asians came across the Pacific. In the mid-1800s, the railroad robber barons and other captains of industry sent labor brokers into rural China to bring Chinese young men to California and other parts of the West as cheap labor. Lured by the tales of America as the land of promise, especially during the gold rush, they came mostly from what was then called the Canton province under labor contracts as indentured workers. A step up from slaves, the indentured Chinese were willing to do unrelenting and dangerous work on the railroads in the continental West and on the pineapple, coffee, and sugar plantations in Hawaii, work that others were not willing to do, and to earn their way out of their labor contracts and hope for something better. Considered fit for back-breaking and hazardous labor, they were considered unfit for citizenship. The yellow peril phenomenon promoted anti-Chinese messages. You can see in this 1882 political cartoon on the right that a Chinese man is barred entry to the quote-unquote Golden Gate of Liberty. According to the sign, communists, Irish predecessors to the IRA, and quote-unquote hoodlums were welcome, but not the Chinese. The first Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 halted immigration from China, a ban that remained in effect for 70 years. The Chinese Exclusion Act was very popular with the American public. The Chinese Exclusion Act created a labor void on the Hawaiian plantations and as well on the mainland in agriculture, mining, fishing, and other local industries, especially along the West Coast and in the intermountain areas. So where did those labor brokers go next? Japan. Meiji-era Japan was undergoing an economic crisis, and the Japanese government and labor brokers found it mutually advantageous to promote U.S. as the land of opportunity to young men in the southwest prefectures of Fukuoka, Hiroshima, Kumamoto, and Yamaguchi. Starting in 1885, 3 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first Japanese immigrants stepped off the ships that brought them to Hawaii, Seattle, and San Francisco. But the Japanese also stepped into those pre-existing yellow peril prejudices against the Chinese. The forever foreign and always alien narrative used against the Chinese would now be used against the Japanese, continuing the characterization that they are unacceptable and unimaginable as Americans. When they satisfied the terms of their labor contracts, some Issei migrated up and down the West Coast to work as crop pickers, domestics, labor mill workers, and cannery workers. They saved their money and became entrepreneurs. In San Diego, Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, Portland, Tacoma, Seattle, they opened boarding houses, hotels, shops, restaurants, nurseries, and other small enterprises. They bought fishing boats and built their own canneries. Discriminatory policies and practices, though, such as redlining, determined where they could and could not live, and yet they would be criticized for not assimilating into white neighborhoods. The Issei farmers took land considered undesirable by the white agribusiness companies and specialized in crops that were labor-intensive, such as strawberries. They utilized high-yield techniques that were used in Japan, such as crop rotation, and became extraordinarily productive and successful. By the turn of the century, the Issei farmers in California were outproducing all other farmers in the state on a per-acre basis. The success of the Japanese farmers led agricultural business organizations to stage the first large-scale anti-Japanese protest in California. Labor groups pressured President Theodore Roosevelt to halt immigration from Japan, and the result was the 1907 Gentleman's Agreement, by which Japan agreed to keep Japanese male laborers from immigrating to Hawaii or the mainland. The Gentleman's Agreement, however, allowed for immigration exceptions. Family members, children, wives, or parents of workers already living in the United States, and those who did not fall within the laborer category, including merchants, students, teachers, diplomatic personnel, and missionaries. The Issei pioneers included my maternal grandmother, Shizu Mitsukawa. In 1914, at the age of 25, she left her life as a daughter of a prosperous merchant family in Osaka to come to Los Angeles. As a well-bred girl of the Meiji era, she received a classical Japanese education. She excelled at Japanese dance, but her real expertise and life passion was as a musician. In the years before World War II, she became known in Little Tokyo and Los Angeles as a classical Japanese music teacher and performer. Her specialty was the shamisen, the three-stringed instrument that is similar to a banjo, and she also taught and performed on the koto, the 13-stringed floor harp. My grandmother is in the black kimono playing the shamisen, and to her right is my mother playing the koto at the age of 11 in 1939. My grandmother met my grandfather, Ayatoshi Kurose, in the Little Tokyo classical music circles as he played the bamboo flute called the shakuhachi. He likewise came from a prosperous merchant family which raised silkworms and other crops in the Hiroshima area. This was actually their family property, which is quite impressive, I think, even by today's standards. But as the fourth son in Meiji-era Japan, he wasn't going to inherit anything. So he decided to take his chances on his prospects in America. In 1903, at the age of 19, he entered the U.S. on a student visa, and he brought with him nothing more than a love of learning, artistic talents, and kindness. My dad used to say that my mother's parents were the city mice, and his parents were the country mice. While my mother's parents were well-educated and refined, my dad's parents were pioneers with very humble roots. They both of my paternal grandparents, Toronosuke and Shizu Kamei, both came from the rural farming areas of Wakayama province in southwest Japan. And I figure that my paternal grandfather, as a 15-year-old in 1906, had just made it into the U.S. before the enactment of the Gentleman's Agreement. My paternal grandmother left for Japan for Hawaii under the Gentleman's Agreement family member exception. She joined her father and her stepmother in the pineapple and sugarcane fields in Kauai before they came on to Los Angeles. My paternal grandparents met in the Japanese American farming community in the South Bay, south of Los Angeles. And here they are in their wedding photo in Gardena in 1920. My father's family grew strawberries, tomatoes, sugar beets, and other vegetables, and they were especially known for their celery. U.S. foreign relations with Japan became increasingly tense as Japan continued its military aggression, and fears and suspicion with geopolitical origins carried over to the people of the same national origin. White labor unions used wedge politics to marshal anti-Japanese sentiment to their cause of eliminating the Japanese as whom they perceived as economic competitors. The 1924 Immigration Act shut down any further immigration from Japan, a ban that would last until the 1952 Walter McCarran Act. Groups such as the Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West wanted to keep this country white. The Yellow Peril propaganda both resulted from and reinforced prevailing notions of white supremacy. The so-called nativists were both appalled and affronted that the Nisei had birthright citizenship and considered it a sham that immigrants whom they didn't consider worthy to be citizens could have children born here who would thereby become citizens. And perhaps you can think of some other examples of descendants of some immigrants who are not considered real citizens or deserving of citizenship today. The powerful agribusiness lobby capitalized on these political forces to enact alien land laws in the western states that prevented the Japanese and other Asians from owning land or holding long-term leases. And perhaps you can think of other examples of institutionalized racial disenfranchisement. With Japan declared as a wartime enemy, the nativist and agribusiness lobbies got the golden opportunity they wanted to remove those they considered un-American and positioned as economic competition. In short, it wasn't simply a matter of wartime hysteria that led to the political pressures to remove and detain persons who shared the same ancestry as the wartime enemy. Almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, our U.S. government started and maintained a false narrative, one that continues to persist today, 80 years later. High-ranking government officials and military commanders started using the term military necessity to justify expansive use of executive powers. The consequence to the Issei was that with Japan declared as an enemy, they were now not just aliens, they were enemy aliens. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy is among those quoted as knowingly using racial antagonism to build support for the actions the government claimed were necessary or important for the war effort. Secretary of Navy Frank Knox knew the U.S. military would be criticized for being caught flat-footed in Hawaii. Before he joined the Roosevelt administration, Secretary Knox was a journalist and senior executive for the Hearst Enterprise, the purveyors of the Yellow Peril journalism. He knew what would run in the headlines. In an attempt to deflect responsibility, Knox told reporters packed in a press conference that Japanese Americans living in Hawaii were to blame for helping Japan attack Pearl Harbor. While there was no evidence of this then or ever, and intelligence officials in Japan and Hawaii disputed his claims in private, Knox was the first official of the U.S. government to put the weight of his office behind what would become the hysterical fear and frenzy of unfounded claims against people of Japanese ancestry in the West Coast. Unfortunately, fake news is not just a function of today's politics. By Christmas of 1941, General Alan Gullion and Major Carl Bendetson in the Army had formulated plans to round up not only those whom the government might have had reason to suspect would or could engage in espionage, but all persons of Japanese ancestry, including the second-generation American-born Nisei citizens. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt was the Army commander in charge of the defense of the West Coast. During his service in World War I, he had developed a deeply rooted prejudice against the Japanese. He famously said, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." By the first week of January 1942, Californians and other West Coast residents were flooding telegrams and letters to their Congress representatives to, quote unquote, get the Japs out. Throughout that month, mayors of major West Coast cities, officials representing the League of California Cities, local law enforcement representatives, governors of the western states, heads of major industries, especially aircraft manufacturers, defense contractors, and agriculture, flooded the FDR administration with demands to remove all Japanese. The labor and agriculture lobbies that had wanted to eliminate the Japanese labor force and farmers from the market entirely now had a cover. One representative of the agricultural lobby put it quite bluntly at a California legislative hearing in 1942. He said, "This is our time to get things done that we've been trying to get done for a quarter of a century." Dr. Seuss ran a whole series of anti-Japanese cartoons, fostering the notion that the Japanese in California were all potential saboteurs for Japan. The politicians and yellow peril-oriented press fed off of each other. On January 29, 1942, her syndicated columnist Henry McLemore published this in the San Francisco Examiner. Oh, come on. Okay, now I'm going to show you the next one. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a distinguished statesman and attorney, was a senior member of FDR's cabinet. He worried that a wholesale uprooting of all Japanese without due process of individual loyalty hearings would make, as he wrote in his diary, a tremendous hole in our constitutional system. However, his aide, John McCloy, himself a Wall Street lawyer, was persuasive in his argument that, quote, "If it's a question of the safety of the country or the Constitution of the United States, why, the Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me." Most Nisei were children, teenagers, and young adults in 1942. For the most part, they had never been to Japan and had no connections with Japan, and they didn't even speak Japanese all that well. You heard that on February 19, 1942, a little more than 10 weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the U.S. military the authority to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, 2/3 of whom were the Nisei American citizens. The Department of Justice and its agency head, the Attorney General, had caved on any objections, constitutional and otherwise, to the military plans to require the Japanese American families to report for transportation to detention centers. To avoid acknowledging that the Nisei had rights as American citizens in the military exclusion orders, our government referred to them with the invented euphemistic term of quote-unquote non-aliens. Congress made it a crime to not comply with the military orders. Most felt they had no choice but to obey. They didn't even know where they were being sent, how long they would be away, or even if they would ever return. They had to sell and close businesses, and yet their bank accounts were frozen. My dad's family had to leave standing several acres of celery that were ready to harvest. They had to store whatever they could with sympathetic friends or in churches and temples, and had to abandon what they didn't sell at a fraction of their worth to scavengers. They never recovered from the loss of their life efforts and savings after this point. Everything about the process was dehumanizing, especially being issued a 5-digit number that replaced their family name. From the moment they arrived at the departure centers to board buses and trains to the so-called assembly centers, they were surrounded by lines of soldiers with guns and fixed bayonets. The photos, though, were not allowed to show that the soldiers pointed their guns and bayonets at them, but there are many, many first-hand accounts telling of this. They were paralyzed with fear. And yet, the San Francisco News reported that most of the evacuees seemed to feel that they were going on a picnic. When they arrived at the assembly centers, they were surrounded by barbed wire, 24-hour armed guards in towers with searchlights, unannounced search, and twice daily roll calls. In short, a prison. Later, when the government tried to justify the mass removal as being for the good of the Japanese Americans, a protective custody to shield them from the threats of the public, the incarcerees asked, then why were the soldiers' guns always pointed inward at us and not outward if they were there to protect us? Many incarcerees lived in horse stalls at the Santa Anita and Tanforan racetracks, reeking of the smell of manure that they could never get rid of. At other assembly centers converted from fairgrounds, such as Puyallup, Washington, incarcerees were put in livestock pens. Thousands more were housed in hastily constructed barracks built on the Army model with mess halls. By the summer of 1942, they were transported to one of 10 War Relocation Authority detention facilities, which have become known as the camps. After 6 months at the Santa Anita Assembly Center, my mother and my grandparents were sent to the Heart Mountain Relocation Center near Cody, Wyoming, where they remained until the end of the war. My father and his grandparents, parents, and siblings were ordered directly from their farm in Orange County, California, to the posting camp in Arizona. You mentioned that you've heard that Topaz is nearby. And like at Topaz, these locations are located in desolate parts of the country that included Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, Arkansas, and one of the commonalities they had was that whether they were in the swamps in Arkansas or the deserts of Manzanar and Heart Mountain, they endured extreme weather without proper clothing, inedible food, limited supplies of hot water, and sporadically functioning toilets and showers without partitions. They were told to stuff straw into sacks for their mattresses, and the overcrowded living quarters lacked any privacy. They set about turning their barren and harsh surroundings into some kind of livable space, building most of their own furniture and ordering supplies from Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward catalogs. But they were still prisoners for an indefinite period of time. 3 who decided to resist were Minoru Yasui of Portland, Oregon, Gordon Hirabayashi of Seattle, Washington, and Fred Korematsu of San Leandro, California, near Oakland, bringing test cases to challenge the constitutionality of the government's action. They each were found guilty in perfunctory trials and appealed their criminal convictions. With behind-the-scenes drama worthy of a reality TV show, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the government actions. About this time, U.S. military leaders decided that young Nisei men who had been incarcerated because they were presumed to be disloyal were now going to be considered loyal enough to be allowed to volunteer for military service. Most of the initial volunteers came from Hawaii, but 805 young Nisei men actually volunteered from behind barbed wire, willing to die for a country that had imprisoned them and their families. On January 20, 1944, our government reinstated the draft, requiring now young Nisei men to leave their incarceration and go to war. Together, the volunteers and the draftee in the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team are credited with helping drive the German army out of Italy. Serving in segregated units under the command of white officers, the combined 100th and 442nd served in some of the bloodiest battles in Europe. The 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team today remains the most decorated military unit for its size and length of service in all of U.S. military history. Nisei with Japanese language skills served with the Military Intelligence Service in the Pacific Theater. They are credited with shortening the war against Japan, which did not anticipate that the U.S. military could decipher their communications. Even after the war had ended, FDR refused to consider releasing the incarcerees until he had won his unprecedented 4th election. Once the exclusion orders were lifted to finally allow the Japanese Americans to return to their West Coast homes, they faced intense discrimination and even terrorism. In 1981, MIS veteran Mitsu Usui recalled that as he returned to his hometown of Los Angeles, wearing his U.S. Army uniform with decorations on his chest, a bus rider called him a damn Jap. The bus rider requested her to apologize to the American soldier or to get off the bus. Rather than apologize, she chose to get off the bus. In the post-war decades, the Issei, and in particular the Nisei, adopted a range of social and psychological responses to the cumulative traumas of their exclusion, detention, and removal, and their resettlement. Their lives were forever divided into before the war and after camp. In 1976, Michi Wagelin, a former incarceree and a self-taught historical researcher, published Years of Infamy The Untold Story of America's Concentration Camps, which became a groundbreaking national bestseller. Vicky was the first person to assemble irrefutable evidence that the government had had no military necessity for the incarceration and had blundered its way through the decisions that were motivated by racial prejudice. Wakeland's research inspired more incarcerees to face their own long-suppressed emotions, to initiate their own forms of investigation and activism, and to finally tell their own stories. One day while I was in college, my father told me some of the challenges that he and his family had faced when they returned to Orange County after the war to try to reestablish farming. They had lost everything, and for the first time, I began to understand the enormity of the injustice that had befallen them. So it was at this time in the mid-1970s that my father was among the Nisei incarcerees and politically engaged third-generation Sansei, some folks that I look up to about 10, 15 years older than I am, who sought to bring attention to this shocking episode in our nation's history and to have the government acknowledge that its wartime actions were wrong. I joined my father and countless other volunteers across the country in legislative and judicial initiatives, and then this movement that became known as the Campaign for Redress, a term taken from the First Amendment that says, as citizens, we have the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. Researchers and a congressional commission uncovered hundreds of thousands of documents in the National Archives that the government never had a factual basis for suspecting the Japanese Americans of wholesale disloyalty, that the government knowingly perpetrated lies to justify the incarceration and covered up attempts by some officials to tell the truth. The government knew that the Japanese Americans did not pose a mass espionage or sabotage threat on the mainland. Military necessity was a false narrative. This commission issued a report in 1983 calling for a congressional apology and directed token restitution to the camp survivors, which became the basis of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, providing the government acknowledgement that the incarceration was wrong. The act provided surviving incarcerees with an apology for the unjustified government actions and token payments on part of our country's only large-scale reparations program to date. And one of the proudest moments in my life was to be an invited guest to the White House to witness President Reagan signing the bill. Researchers also found that Charles Fahey, the U.S. Solicitor General, who represented the government before the Supreme Court, knowingly lied to the Supreme Court in the government's briefs and in his oral argument. Armed with this mountain of evidence that could have changed the outcome of their cases, the three wartime resistors, Yasui, Hirabayashi, and Korematsu, filed petitions known as Petitions of Coram Nobis in 1983 to have their criminal convictions vacated. And ultimately, all three criminal convictions were vacated. But those results do not overturn the 1944 Supreme Court decisions. Discredited, though especially the Korematsu opinion has become, it still exists today as precedence that the government need not offer any proof when the government claims it is acting out of, in the wartime phrase, military necessity, or in today's terms, in the interest of national security. In fact, in its 2018 decision in Trump versus Hawaii, known as the travel ban case, the Supreme Court followed the Korematsu court logic of accepting without inquiry the executive branch's assertion of national security as constitutional justification for acknowledged infringement of civil liberties of individuals on the basis of national origin and religion. Now, I hear from those who say, war is hell, everyone suffers, let it lie, and move on. So why should we care about this episode in our nation's past, 80 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the issuance of Executive Order 9066? I believe we should care because there are those who cite the Japanese American incarceration as justification for doing again simply because it was done before. In September 2018, Los Angeles City Council member David Rue held an event in his district in Sherman Oaks to talk with his constituents about possible homeless shelter and housing sites in his district. One attendee stood up to say that the federal government should just move the homeless out of urban areas and cited the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans as an example of how the government had removed, in his words, undesirables before. And since the government had done it before, why couldn't it just do that again? We saw history repeating itself after 9/11. We saw this in the 2016 presidential campaign when proposals were floated to require all Muslims, alien and citizen, in this country to register so that they could be tracked and facilitate locating them in the event of a national security crisis. As you saw from earlier in my remarks, this is exactly what happened to the Issei. Today we see families separated at the border. We see children held in detention facilities without adequate education or health care. We see echoes of the past repeated today. And again and again. Not long after Russia's attack on Ukraine began, and we all started to see images of Ukrainians leaving their homes behind with only what they could carry. One of my best friends who is Ukrainian said to me that she remembered me showing this photo on the left of the Japanese American community being forcibly removed from Bainbridge Island, Washington, with only what they could carry. And she said she has new appreciation for what that meant in 1942 and what it now means in 2022. As part of my research, I examined the War Relocation Authority records on my incarcerated family members in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And in them, I was fortunate enough to discover some real treasures of family history, such as a photo of my father at the age of about 15 or 16. But I was also grieved to learn of, in their medical records, of my grandparents' poor health, which was exacerbated by the harsh camp environment. And I was angered to read comments about their personalities included in sociological assessments that they most likely had no idea were being made. And I was amazed to discover the receipt issued to my grandfather when he retrieved his trunk from storage upon his return to Los Angeles in February 1946. His trunk now sits in my living room, an ever-present reminder of my family's wartime experience. And the story of my grandfather's trunk is just one of thousands that could be told about the incarceration experience. The legacies of those who experienced it having been cloaked by emotion and obscured by the passage of time. And yet, sometimes those messages are hiding in plain sight. So I feel a responsibility to share those messages that we have today. In 1942, the Japanese Americans had no political clout. And but for some Quakers and other few religiously grounded individuals, neither did they have any allies. So now there's a commitment among those of us who know the incarceration story to speak out on behalf of others whose civil liberties are similarly threatened, whether by racial prejudice or other form of inequality. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this message with you today.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was just enormously rich. We have 15 minutes for discussion. We invite your questions. Please come up to this side of the room and speak into the microphone so that the recording can pick up on the questions. Recognize that some of you may need to leave before 1, but we'll finish at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Caleb Harding. I'm a computer science major. So in talking about this standing precedent in the Supreme Court, is there any way to overturn a precedent without, I guess, the government repeating that action and then getting sued for it? Or like how would that work?
Well, the process of the Supreme Court follows a concept known as stare decisis, which means that they're supposed to follow the chain of case decisions for the facts that most closely approximate the situation of the decision that's before them. And so while there hasn't been the exact same circumstance, although Justice Sotomayor in her dissent vigorously argued that there was, Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion in the Trump versus Hawaii case, referred to the Korematsu case as, well, having discredited in the courts of history, meaning this was his opinion. It didn't have anything to do in the bearing of being able to overturn the Korematsu decision. The basis of the argument for why Korematsu logic has been continued by the court is because over time both the legislature and the judicial branch have allowed the executive branch to have this unfettered ability to say, well, we say that there's a national security reason for this. We don't have to tell you the reasons why or present in any court record the evidence as to why we say that there is a military necessity or national security reason for it. And that's what, back in 1942, Professor Eugene Rostow said that the war of business should not be left to generals. So take my course. At USC, we go into this whole separation of powers question, and it's, in shorthand, it's our Constitution was meant to have a three-legged stool with checks and balances among the three branches. And what we have now is an imbalance, so one leg of the stool is much stronger in the executive branch.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm studying history here at BYU. And I just had a question. I wanted to get your thoughts on how we can continue to educate the public on history and also use the stories from history to defend freedom and equality.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for coming for the talk today. Is I think a great vehicle. I'm very gratified by the reaction to the book for people who knew nothing about it, or even Japanese family members who thought they knew a lot about the camp experience and the ramifications for today and are learning it. So I think just the openness and willingness to learn. I challenge my students to think of this as I call it a framework for reference. So whether, no matter what's going on in the news or what might be of meaning to them in terms of how they identify in their lives, that just to use it as as a comparative tool, and you can draw your own conclusions and take your own actions. And something that I'm really gratified by, which is I think is a change today versus when I was your age working on the Redress campaign, is there's much more of a appreciation of the importance of organizations and communities working together, and not everybody just looking out for their own silo, but looking out for one another.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure, thank you.
My name is Vicky Mayatani, and I'm a Sansei, which means third generation Japanese American. Thank you so much. This was very meaningful. My father was an Issei. He was farming here in Utah, and so he wasn't incarcerated. However, he housed several families in his chicken coop that had come from mostly San Jose. I want to know how many people were able to flee before they were incarcerated. So he housed them in his chicken coop for several years until the war was over.
Wow. Oh, okay.
The nice story is that they had to give up their farmland, I think in Fresno area, but the farmers around him farmed their land, and they said when the war's over, you can come back and reclaim your land. And that was a fortunate situation for these people that that's a famous story, actually. Because it was so rare and right.
And so
I'm just curious how many were able to flee before they had to be incarcerated.
There aren't very good numbers on that, and it wasn't very many, right? Because for the most part, they couldn't afford to go. They didn't have any place else they could go.
Thank you.
Joel Campbell. I teach in journalism, so you're talking about how the press at the time covered this is a very fascination to me. Was there anybody, I mean, Hearst and all those were very much anti-Japanese, yellow peril, as you say. Was there any journalist that stood up for the rights of the people, or was it pretty much, this is the way it has to be?
Yeah, well, for the most part, it was, and of course, for the rest of the United States, they might not have ever had any exposure to the Chinese or the Japanese. For the rest of the country, this was very much a West Coast issue. They only knew what they were reading in the newspaper and hearing on the radio. And so there's a whole generation out there that that's what they heard, and that's what they accepted as the truth. And as the line in South Pacific is, they had to be carefully taught. And so there's a whole generation of folks that's all they knew about the story, and so it must be true. There's a couple of examples. There's one that I include in my book about a journalist that took a balanced view, not necessarily pro-Japanese American view, but that was really the exception.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wyatt. I study animation here at BYU. I had a question, and I understand this. I don't know if you touched on it in your book at all, and I understand that the information could be difficult to get to, but I'm curious if mainland Japan heard about the treatment of Japanese Americans here, and if they did, what their response was.
Very good question. Yeah, so they very much knew about it, and they used it as propaganda. That the United States was engaging in a race war, and these were arguments that members of FDR's cabinet took to him to say, we've walked into this. The government just made this up as they went along, right, and then had to deal with the consequences as there was backlash or pushback. And that did get raised in presidential cabinet discussions, that Japan was using this as propaganda against the U.S. But the political considerations of how important the West Coast state votes were to the Roosevelt administration, and also the concept of closing rank behind a wartime president, as this was the commander-in-chief, and that was it was most important to do things that they were justifying as necessary to win the war. But they did know about it, and also. Oh boy, there's a lot here. One of the original concepts for why they should be gathered up and detained was because they would be used as POW and other prisoner exchanges with Japan, and that did happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Eric Heyer. I'm in the political science department and the coordinator for Asian studies. I want to know, based on your research, if you could comment on the sort of the unequal treatment among Japanese communities, where Japanese in Hawaii, except with some exceptions, were not incarcerated. Right. Japanese here in Utah, there were many prominent Japanese families here in Utah were not incarcerated. In fact, lived in proximity to the camps. But Japanese in California were. What is sort of the politics and the law of this unequal treatment among the Japanese community in the United States?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's another great question. So there were proposals that were floated in Washington, D.C. that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii should be removed to the mainland. And for the most part, they died early deaths in terms of the consideration. Many reasons. One, because they were the majority minority, and so it were too important to the labor force and especially to the wartime efforts. Another was that the logistical consideration of devoting the military ships and the personnel to actually remove them all, to bring them to the United States, was deemed to be, not a good idea. Another important factor was the martial law was declared in Hawaii immediately after Pearl Harbor. So the entire state was under martial law which was different from it was never declared on the West Coast. So there were already security measures such as curfews and blackouts and whatnot that applied to everyone, not just it didn't need to apply to just Japanese Americans. But I think a major factor was just the sensibilities of the Army commander that was in charge then, General Emmons. And he just was a much more reasonable person and just said, no, we're not going to do that. Whereas General DeWitt, who was one of his contemporaries, had this really irrational fear of persons of Japanese ancestry. The areas that were designated were the purview of the military, of the Western Defense Command, and they just drew a line down the western coast from the top of Washington down through Oregon, California, and into a bit of Arizona. And it was pretty much an arbitrary line. Somebody just went like this and said, this is the military zone, and declared it the military theater of operations. And that was the basis upon which they exercised the authority to remove them. There's all kinds of stories about how originally a border through Arizona, and you mentioned the nearby the Topaz, but there were farmers nearby. There's all kinds of stories about how they went back and adjusted borders to either exclude people that they wanted to keep because they were important to the war effort or whatever, or to be able to change the border to make sure that they got included to remove them. And there were many cities, little towns, little community enclaves that were just decimated and never repopulated. There's a story of the strawberry farmers in Florida outside of Sacramento. 500 families were removed, and the entire community did not reconstitute after the war. Tacoma, what was known as Nihonmachi, the little Tokyo equivalent in Tacoma, never reconstituted after the war. So it was unequal, and then it was, and I've been asked about, why did some people go here and some people from the same community went to other camps. The Army had the Census Bureau data, and this was all about logistics, and they were trying to keep the areas of the number of people that they were dealing with in terms of transportation into relatively equal numbers. And so they divided up the exclusion areas according to how many people that were in that concentration, that area. And they purposefully, I think, sent them to different places to break up the communities.
Thank you so much for your great questions, and please join me in thanking Professor Kamei for a wonderful presentation.